Foodtastic plans to bring hundreds of Dunkin' shops to Canada as early as this year. The first location is expected to open in late 2026 or early 2027, with the initial focus on the Toronto and Montreal markets, before expanding to Quebec and Ontario broadly through the first 2 years, followed by the Maritimes and the West Coast. The announcement comes nearly 8 years after Dunkin' made its last exit from the Canadian market.
Dunkin Donuts is returning to Canada after disappearing from the country 7 years ago. But this time, something feels completely different. The company is not walking into Canada like a confident American giant expanding overseas. Instead, executives are carefully promising Canadians that stores will be locally operated, menus will be adapted for Canadian tastes, and franchise owners will be Canadian taxpayers hiring Canadian workers. For a donut chain, that is unusually defensive language, and it says something uncomfortable about what Trump-era tensions may have done to America's image north of the border.
And are you worried at all coming in at a time when America's not the most beloved neighbor for Canada right now? Worried about any backlash about that?
Like I said, Foodtastic bought the rights here to Canada, so we are a Canadian company. We're based in Montreal and Toronto. We pay taxes here. The franchisees are all going to be Canadians.
The comeback became official this week after Foodtastic, one of Canada's largest restaurant operators, announced a long-term franchise agreement with Inspire Brands to relaunch Dunkin' across Canada. The rollout is massive. Foodtastic says it plans to open roughly 50 Dunkin' locations per year beginning in 2027, eventually scaling into hundreds of restaurants nationwide. The first expansion phase will focus on Toronto and Montreal before moving into Alberta, British Columbia, and the Maritimes. That alone would already be a major restaurant industry story, but Dunkin's history in Canada adds another layer to the situation. The company once had a much larger footprint north of the border before slowly collapsing under franchise disputes and pressure from Tim Hortons. The final Canadian Dunkin' location shut down in 2018. Now the company is trying again, but under very different political conditions. During interviews promoting the relaunch, Foodtastic executives repeatedly stressed that the expansion would be managed by a Canadian company headquartered in Montreal and Toronto. They emphasized Canadian franchise ownership, Canadian hiring, and Canadian tax contributions. Executives also openly acknowledged that anti-American sentiment currently exists in parts of Canada due to tensions with Washington. That changed the conversation immediately. Suddenly, this was no longer just a coffee story. It became a story about how American corporations now feel pressure to
One of the most revealing parts of this story is how much attention Dunkin' is paying to consumer mood, not pricing, not store design, not menu innovation, political mood. Executives are clearly aware that parts of the Canadian public have become more skeptical toward the United States after years of tariff fights, sovereignty rhetoric, and trade pressure coming out of Washington. And there are now real numbers backing that up. Polling tied to the trade dispute found that roughly 77% of Canadians supported retaliatory tariffs against American imports, while another survey showed around 91% of Canadians wanted the country to reduce economic dependence on the United States altogether. That is a huge shift for a country where roughly 70% of exports still go to the American market. The tension has already started spilling into consumer behavior. Canadian travel to the United States reportedly dropped sharply during the height of the tariff conflict, while Buy Canadian campaigns expanded across retail, food, and alcohol sectors. That matters because companies understand consumer sentiment eventually turns into spending behavior, and suddenly Dunkin's rollout starts looking less like a normal restaurant expansion and more like a trust rebuilding campaign.
The situation becomes even more complicated because Dunkin' is not entering a neutral market. It is challenging Tim Hortons. And Tim Hortons operates differently inside Canadian culture than almost any major chain in North America. The company still controls thousands of locations across Canada and has built itself into daily Canadian routines over multiple generations. In many towns, the local Tim Hortons is where construction workers stop before sunrise, where teenagers gather after hockey practice, and where families warm up during winter road trips.
That emotional attachment creates a difficult problem for Dunkin. The company is not simply asking Canadians to try another coffee brand. It is asking consumers to partially replace habits tied to local identity at a moment when political tensions with the United States are already elevated. That helps explain why Foodtastic executives immediately started talking about localization. The company says Canadian menus will differ from the US version. Products will be adjusted for local tastes, and the rollout will happen gradually instead of aggressively flooding the market. That is not how dominant American brands used to behave in Canada. For years, many U.S. corporations assumed cultural familiarity alone guaranteed success north of the border. Now they are discovering the market has become more selective, economically, culturally, and politically.
The larger problem for American brands is that Trump's political style keeps spilling into industries that normally would have nothing to do with trade politics. Coffee chains are not negotiating tariffs. Restaurant franchises are not rewriting USMCA rules. But the broader atmosphere surrounding Canada-US relations still shapes how consumers perceive American companies. And businesses know it. That is why Dunkin executives sounded unusually eager to separate themselves from Washington politics during interviews. They repeatedly stressed local ownership and local economic benefits because they understand the brand is entering Canada during one of the most politically tense periods in recent Canada-US economic history. Meanwhile, Mark Carney's government continues pushing diversification strategies designed to reduce Canada's vulnerability to U.S. political swings ahead of the 2026 USMCA review. Carney recently warned that Canada would not allow Washington to dictate the terms of future trade negotiations, reflecting a noticeably tougher posture from Ottawa compared with previous years. Ironically, Trump's pressure campaign may be accelerating exactly the behavior Washington hoped to stop: Canadian economic nationalism, diversification away from U.S. dependence, and growing skepticism toward American corporate influence. At the same time, the scale of the Dunkin rollout sends another signal that Canadian officials will quietly appreciate. Despite all the rhetoric about tariffs, reshoring, and economic confrontation, companies are still committing major long-term investment into Canada, and Foodtastic is not a small operator gambling on a trend. The company already controls roughly 1,200 restaurants across the country and says it opens around 2 new locations every week across its network. That gives Dunkin immediate access to one of the most stable consumer markets in North America. The financial estimates are also significant. Based on typical franchise development costs, opening a single Dunkin location can cost between roughly US $900,000 and US $1.2 million once construction, equipment, leases, staffing, and operational setup are included. That means opening 50 locations per year could represent roughly US $45–60 million in direct annual investment during the initial rollout phase alone. And if Dunkin eventually reaches several hundred Canadian locations, the total economic footprint could approach or even exceed Canadian $1 billion over time once franchise development, construction, supply chains, commercial real estate, logistics, and hiring are fully included. Thousands of jobs could also be tied to the expansion through restaurant staffing, food distribution, construction work, and franchise operations. That is a surprisingly large economic story hiding underneath what initially looked like a simple donut headline.
Dunkin's comeback is still in its early stages. The first stores have not even opened yet, and Tim Hortons remains deeply dominant across the country. There is no guarantee Canadian consumers will fully embrace another large American chain. But the rollout already exposed something important. American corporations entering Canada now feel pressure to explain themselves politically before they even start selling products. They are emphasizing Canadian jobs, Canadian ownership, Canadian taxes, and local adaptation because they understand the public mood has changed. And that may become one of the most underestimated consequences of Trump-era tensions. Not fewer American brands in Canada. More American brands trying to convince Canadians they are no longer acting like American brands at all.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has talked about in the past how he and Canada can play a bit of a bigger role on that stage, and this is a perfect example of that.
Canada is set to be home to a new multinational bank for defense projects by NATO members and allies.
Canada is about to host a $130 billion NATO defense bank, and this isn't just about financing, it's about control. Because in modern warfare, the country that controls the money doesn't just support strategy, it shapes it. And right now, NATO allies are quietly handing that leverage to Canada, not the United States. That shift sets the stage for a deeper change in how power inside the alliance actually works. In April 2026, NATO members and partner countries agreed to establish a new Defense, Security, and Resilience Bank, with Canada selected as the host nation. The goal is straightforward: provide long-term, low-cost financing for defense projects across the alliance, including weapons procurement, infrastructure, and supply chain expansion. The scale tells the real story. This institution is expected to mobilize more than $130 billion in capital, backed by a mix of governments and major global financial institutions. In practical terms, it creates a centralized funding engine for NATO's next generation of military investment. This decision also arrives at a politically sensitive moment. The United States under President Donald Trump continues to pressure allies on defense spending, while signaling a more transactional approach to NATO commitments. That combination has introduced uncertainty into long-term planning across the alliance. Instead of waiting for that uncertainty to resolve, allies moved ahead. They built a system that could operate through it, and they placed it in Canada. That choice is what turns this from a technical development into a strategic one.
It is a signal that NATO members are putting their trust in Canada and believe Canada can play a key role in the future of the membership and a future of the group at a time when we've seen, President Trump at times express, a lack of interest in NATO as it stands.
To understand the real impact, you have to start with a simple principle. Whoever controls capital controls capability. Modern defense systems don't just rely on engineering or manpower. They depend on stable financial pipelines that support multi-decade procurement cycles, industrial expansion, and infrastructure development. These are not short-term decisions. They are commitments that shape military capacity for decades. By hosting this bank, Canada steps into the point where those financial flows come together. It becomes the place where projects are supported, sustained, and scaled. That doesn't mean Canada dictates every outcome, but it does mean it sits much closer to the center of how those outcomes are determined. And in strategic terms, proximity to the flow of capital is proximity to influence. That position naturally translates into a deeper role in shaping NATO's future capabilities. When financing is centralized, visibility follows. Canada gains insight into which defense programs are expanding, which technologies are being prioritized, and where the alliance is directing its long-term resources. Over time, that insight allows Canada to align its own industrial and strategic planning with those priorities. This creates a reinforcing cycle. Canadian firms, infrastructure, and partnerships can integrate more directly into NATO's defense ecosystem, attracting investment and scaling alongside alliance priorities. The financial role strengthens industrial positioning, and industrial positioning strengthens political relevance. The result is not just participation, but integration at a much higher level, one that can influence tens of billions of dollars in defense-related activity over the coming years.
As this system develops, it inevitably affects how power is distributed within NATO. For decades, the United States has been the central hub across military, financial, and political dimensions. That role is not disappearing, but it is evolving. By establishing a major financial institution outside the United States, NATO is introducing a new layer into its structure, one that does not rely entirely on Washington. This shift is less about weakening the United States and more about strengthening the alliance as a whole. By spreading key functions across multiple countries, NATO becomes more resilient to political changes in any single capital. At the same time, this reduces the degree to which all decisions flow through the United States. Power is no longer concentrated in one place. It is distributed across a broader network, and Canada is now a central node in that network.
That redistribution has been shaped, in part, by the current political environment in Washington. The Trump administration has applied sustained pressure on NATO allies, pushing for higher defense spending while signaling that U.S. commitments may not always be unconditional. In the short term, this has driven increased investment across the alliance. But over the longer term, it has introduced uncertainty into a system that depends on consistency. Defense planning cannot operate on shifting signals. It requires stable expectations over decades. Faced with that uncertainty, allies have adapted. They have not rejected U.S. leadership, but they have begun to build structures that reduce reliance on it. The Canada Bank is one of those structures. It allows NATO to continue expanding its capabilities without tying every financial decision to the political climate in Washington. This is not confrontation, it is strategic preparation.
What makes this development particularly effective for Canada is how it has been executed. There has been no dramatic shift in tone, no attempt to openly challenge the United States. Instead, Canada has built credibility through consistency. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, it has expanded defense commitments, strengthened ties with European partners, and positioned itself as a reliable anchor within the alliance. Hosting the bank builds directly on that foundation. It deepens Canada's role without provoking conflict, allowing influence to grow through structure rather than rhetoric. At the same time, this move supports Canada's broader economic strategy. Defense financing at this scale connects directly to industries like advanced manufacturing, energy, and critical minerals, all areas where Canada holds strategic advantages. It creates opportunities for investment, job growth, and long-term industrial development. This is where geopolitics and economics converge. The more central Canada becomes in financing defense, the more central it becomes in producing and supporting it.
Seen in isolation, the Canada Bank is significant, but placed in context, it becomes part of a larger trajectory. Canada is strengthening its partnerships with Europe, expanding its defense footprint, and investing in infrastructure and strategic sectors. At the same time, it is reducing its reliance on the United States while remaining fully engaged within the alliance. That balance is intentional. Canada is not stepping away from its closest ally, but it is ensuring that its position is not defined by dependency. Instead, it is building a more flexible and resilient role within a changing global system. And that is what makes this moment different. It is not just a reaction to current events, but a reflection of a longer-term strategy.
The Canada Bank is more than a financing tool. It is a structural shift in how NATO organizes power. By hosting this institution, Canada gains a level of influence that extends beyond its size. It becomes part of the mechanism that determines how defense capabilities are funded, scaled, and sustained. For the United States, this does not signal an immediate loss of leadership, but it does mark a change in how that leadership is shared. Influence is no longer concentrated in one place. It is distributed across a network that is becoming more complex and more resilient. And that leads to a simple but important question. If Canada now helps control the financial backbone of NATO, how long before it starts shaping the direction of the alliance itself?